Hey there, art nerds. Welcome back for another Easily Influenced. This time, we're easily influenced by Sarah Simon of the Mint Gardener. And I had the pleasure of taking one of her classes at NAMTA this year. So I have gotten to do basically all. We read the book, I took a class, and we tried her collaboration with Stoneground. And I'm really excited to be able to talk about all three of these with you guys today. Now, despite me taking a class, we don't know each other, we don't have any kind of personal relationship with one another, and we have not been in any sort of correspondence. So I really want to make it clear that whatever I critique today, it is not a personal critique or a personal criticism, because we do not know each other, and that is just not the goal of that. I also ask that you be respectful and not send the review to the author. Generally, that is considered in bad taste. And it's not because I am ashamed of what I had to say or embarrassed by what I had to say or wouldn't stand by it, but simply the book is out. The book has been out for years. There is nothing that anybody can do other than releasing a revised edition. There is nothing that anybody can do when it comes to a product that is already out. This critique is to help other people. This review really is to help other people who are interested in buying the books or buying the watercolors or taking a class decide if that is a good fit for them and a good use of their money, rather than deciding anything further than that, basically, because reviews are for consumers, people who are interested in the products themselves. I hope you guys enjoy hanging out with me today, because I always like sharing these with you guys, and let's jump into it. Since we're being easily influenced by Sarah Simon, the Mint Gardener, I wanted to share a little bit of context, because this is the only easily influenced that I'm doing where I actually had the benefit of seeing this person in person, meeting this person in person, and taking a class with this person. No one else so far in the Easily Influenced series have I taken any in-person classes with, have I met at all. So I took the watercolor class that was put on by Hahnemule and Sarah Simon and Stoneground paint while I was at NAMTA. It was a $50 a person class. I took the class with a friend of mine, and we really enjoyed it. I talked about it more in the NAMTA vlog. There were some problems with the internet with the class. That's not an uncommon problem, and as a teaching artist myself, I know how frustrating that can be, but Sarah handled it really well. It was a more relaxed, low-key kind of class. It wasn't just led by her. The owners of Stoneground are also watercolor artists, and we're also walking around and explaining things. The guy from Hahnemule was walking around and explaining things. So it was like having multiple teachers at once. So I don't think this is necessarily indicative of Sarah Simon's normal in-person watercolor classes, but that was my experience with it. And I really, really enjoyed it. They brought in flowers from a local florist. That really means a lot as a Louisiana girl when they support local. They just put that effort into making it a fun and special experience that wasn't high stress and was very low key in a very positive way. I really enjoyed it. I felt like she comported herself very professionally. She was very put together. Even when things had hiccups, she handled it with a lot of grace. It was very admirable. I mean, we like chit-chatted like a tiny little bitty bit, but it wasn't like we know each other. I would not say that we're like friendly or even acquaintances. So while I'm a little bit biased in her favor, I feel good doing this review for a couple of reasons. So in this Easily Influenced, we're not just talking about Sarah Simon and her book Modern Watercolor Botanicals, but we're also talking about her collaboration with Stoneground paint. And during that class, guess what we used? Guess what we got dot samples for? Guess what I ended up falling in love with and really enjoy and think is a beautiful paint? Stoneground. So I feel like, well, I definitely am so easily influenced, but this time I think it's a good one. I think it's going to be a really upbeat and positive easily influenced. There's a lot to love about the collaboration. There's a lot to really love about her art. And I'm really hoping that her book holds up to the experience that I had in the class and kind of the vision I have in my mind of how she comports herself. So I'm really hopeful for this one, but I did want to disclose it, include a little bit of footage from the class. Out of respect for her, I didn't like record the class. I like recorded the flowers and recorded the paints, like, you know, stuff that's on my table's top that I can control. But I did want to disclose this with you guys. Anybody who watches my channel regularly, you probably already knew it, but I know some of you guys are new here because you are interested in the Mint Gardener. You're interested in how influential artists on the internet became influential artists on the internet. You're interested in growing your own art business, and you want to see what other people are doing that you can learn and borrow from, because that's why I'm here. I'm interested in that as well. So the way I want to do this Easily Influenced is kind of the way we've been doing Easily Influenced, where we're going to start with the book. I have the spiral bound version of Modern Watercolor Botanicals, and I think I picked this up from a Barnes & Noble. I paid about $30 according to the sticker on it. It has an orange sticker on it, so it might have been on sale. As I have said before, with the books that have spiral binding as an option, I really like the spiral binding. I like that you can kind of fold it and bend it and flex it to your needs. It does, in my opinion, make it a little easier. Oh, I like how it got stuck. Prove me a fool, book. I like how it can travel a little easier. It can be something that is maybe a little easier to bring along with you if you are reading and then doing the project. Sorry, I figured out how to fix it. So I like the spiral binding. There are a lot of watercolor how-to books that have spiral binding, and what I've noticed is that typically the spiral binding, while very nice, kind of cranks the price of the book from like $25, maybe even less on sale, depending on when you buy them and where you're buying them from, up into the 30s. So that's why, even though there are a lot of books that we've talked about in the Easily Influenced series that did have a nice spiral binding, I've opted not to buy every single one like that, because this is out of pocket with funds from my Patreon, and I have to make it work as best as I can. So anyway, I am looking forward to reading this book. I will check in with you guys after I've read it with my thoughts and with my notes, and I look forward to seeing you guys then. Hey there, art nerds. So I have been told that drinking a warm drink makes people appear more approachable, friendly, and cozy on this here internet. So I am going to be enjoying the beverage of my people today, the fellow NDs out there. I'm going to be having a Dr. Pepper, and the reason for that is I have a migraine today, and gee, how many of us actually use Coke and Dr. Pepper to help with that? So I wanted to talk to you guys about Sarah Simon's Modern Watercolor Botanicals. I just finished this book, and I didn't want to put it off and forget the things that I wanted to talk about. So that's why we are rolling with a Dr. Pepper and a migraine. This is actually my second Dr. Pepper today, and this one is hot, but that is okay. It still tastes good. So this is the first book that I read that was published by Page Tate & Co. This is an imprint of Blue Star Press. And they've also done Allie Koch's book, K-O-C-H. Her book on, I believe, drawing modern botanical watercolors, something like that. I will probably talk about that a little bit later on. So this is a new art publisher to me. This was published in 2019, so it actually predates most of the books we talked about in the series. Not all, but most. So I kind of noticed during the pandemic that there was this real renaissance of people getting into watercolor, people getting into art because they're at home, and this is a relaxing activity that they can do with arguably minimal supplies that can be ordered on the internet, right? The perfect combination for most people. Maybe you can be painting on your sofa while your kids are watching TV, that sort of thing, right? I noticed a lot of people got into watercolor during the pandemic, and because of that, a plethora of watercolor books were published during this time period, or that time period. This book predates that a little bit. So some of the things we're going to talk about, I feel maybe set the stage for later books, or maybe she shouldn't be held as much to task because she was an earlier book. That is not to say that watercolor books did not exist before 2019, not by a long shot, just that I believe that some of the people who were getting into watercolor at that time period may not have read those earlier books. In general, I enjoyed this book. This is both a learning, like not quite lessons, but kind of like lessons plus project sort of book with suggestions on what beginners can do as well as what intermediate to advanced painters can do. And I really appreciate that. I also want to point out that the back of the book has templates that you can use. So I think this is a great one if you want to get into watercolor, but you're not super secure on your drawing skills. I really don't think you should let your drawing ability hinder your interest in getting into watercolor. And I say this as a watercolor comic book illustrator, right? So I do really value drawing skills, but I would hate for people feeling like they don't draw well enough to never start watercolor, because there's so much to watercolor, there's so much you can do with it. And I think templates really help ease people into it, and you can always change the template to reflect your taste or ignore it entirely. So I do love when books include templates. I also purchased the spiral bound version. I paid $29.99, and I believe I got this at Barnes & Noble here in Southeast Louisiana, but I've had it for a little while. I've been meaning, part of the Easily Influenced series is an excuse to read through these books, or to make myself read through these books, to hold myself accountable. That's the word we want. To read through these books that I've been collecting for a while. Something I understand but I don't love are these metal edges. I found that as I was carrying this book around with me from place to place and kind of working on this review, these edges would catch on things, they would scrape my legs, that sort of thing. So while I love the practicality of a spiral bound book and I love the really heavy covers, I did find the metal edges, while pretty, were not actually very helpful for me and tended to catch on things. Pages 15 through 41 are an introduction to watercolor, and the type in this book is really small. You better put your reading glasses on because it is tiny and dense. This is a very text-heavy book. On page 8, she talks about wanting to address 3 different skill levels of watercolorists: beginner, intermediate, and advanced. And she mentions on that page that there's traceable art at the end. And I appreciate that she mentions that really early on, because not everybody flips through an entire book. Sometimes you want things to be a surprise. And just mentioning it early on so people know it's there when they're starting their project, really smart idea. Her grandmother and her mother both painted, and she says that she drew, well, copied Archie comics when she was a youngin'. So we have kind of a similar appeal to line art with watercolor illustrative art. So we have that in common. On page 11, she says, I will help you stock up on supplies, explore basic techniques, and discover inspiration through color and botanicals. I'll also walk you through composition and color harmony. And I wrote, I'll hold you to that. And the reason I mention that is because these are actually 2 areas that I've noticed a lot of people, and myself included, have problems with, they struggle with. When I was teaching adults at NCE, color harmony when people were painting their comics, and composition and page layout were 2 of the biggest questions that I would get. So I do want to see her address that. Not everyone handles it the same way, but it's always neat to get inside the head of another artist. On page 18, she mentions having essentials as well as nice to haves. Actually, that is, I believe, on page 13. Yes, here we are. And I made a note to myself to read them to you guys. So her essentials are student grade watercolor paint set, Reeves tube paint set 24. I don't think that set's actually available anymore through Michaels, but again, this was published in 2019. Student grade round brushes, Princeton sizes 1 and 4. Student grade watercolor paper, Strathmore, minimum 140 pound. Painting palette or large white dinner plate, and she and I are simpatico on that one. Color pencils, blush and light pink, or blush/light pink, as well as gray. HB pencil, although any number 2 graphite pencil works well. pencil sharpener, art gum eraser from Prismacolor, water. She uses mason jars filled with tap water. A clean jar works best so you can see when the water needs changing. Paper towels for blotting, and scrap paper for testing and marks. And as I'm going through this Easily Influenced series, I have to remind myself that we all have different tastes. This is what works for her, and this is also what she feels is accessible to beginner artists. So we might not agree on some of these points, but these are just her personal preferences. Under nice to have, she includes a gouache paint set, Reeves tube paint set of 12, 18, or 24, individual gouache tubes, specifically Winsor & Newton Flesh and oxide of chromium, Dr. P.H. Martin's bleed proof white for gouache, micron pin set with multiple sizes, ideally 005, 01, 02, 03, 05, 08, so the basic set. Round brushes in multiple sizes, specifically 20 over 0, 10 over 0, 5 over 0, 0, 1, 3, 4, 5, 6. Arches are Hahnemule cold pressed paper, 140 pound weight. Set of color pencils, Sakura Koi coloring brush, colorless blender for blending out splatters and mistakes. And I found that one intriguing because I've never tried that particular technique, and that is something I would be interested in trying. I've tried a bunch of different ways to remove splatters and blots, but I haven't tried that one. As well as a light box for tracing. And then on page 15, she makes a statement about what is in watercolor paint. She says that it is powdered pigment to give color, plus gum arabic, a binder to hold together and to keep it on your paper. And look, the nitpicky in me has to point out, because I review a lot of watercolor paints and for clarity, watercolor paint is actually pigment or lake pigment, binder like gum arabic, honey, gelatin, etc., and a preservative like clove oil. It needs the preservative because otherwise it will mold. And some of you guys have said that your paints mold anyway, which is a shame. So that preservative is really important. But I do agree with her sentiment. Her sentiment is that she loves the versatility of watercolor paint. You can smooth it onto paper in its most translucent form, using just a hint of color to suggest its presence, or you can layer it on thick, building in color and texture to make a bold statement. Watercolor paint is unique in its structure and is made of, and then because of the unique binding agent of gum arabic, watercolor pigments are suspended and can be reanimated with water, meaning you can use it again after it dries by just adding more water. By contrast, acrylics and oils dry out. If any paint is left over on your palette, it becomes useless, which can feel like such a waste. That's one of the things that really draws me to watercolor, is it's a very, very forgiving medium in a lot of ways. So on page 16, she has a really charming brush diagram. And I made a note to myself that this book is already wordy. It's very text heavy and image light. I feel like photos would be easier to understand than these massive chunks of text. On page 17, she talks about her workstation. And again, I'd love to see photos of her desk. She talks about working at her grandmother's station secretary desk for like her beginning years as a watercolorist. I would love to see how she set this up. It sounds very aesthetic. It sounds very charming. And also I have a secretary desk that we use as a mailing station. So I would love to see photos of her secretary desk and how she has it set up. I would also love to see photos of her rolling cart for inspiration, because I use rolling carts in my studio and they are a mess. So if there's any organization tricks I should be picking up, I'd love to see them. On page 18, she has a photo visual I'm going to bring it up on the screen anyway. Visual comparison of student grade paper versus professional paper, and I really appreciate this. I also appreciate her disclosing the paper that she uses so that I don't have to play detective the way I have in some of the other books we've talked about in this series. On page 19, she has an explanation of how she actually uses the Koi blender to remove those splatters, and I appreciate that as well. On page 20, she talks about gouache and watercolor. So one thing I want to remind you guys of, we're going to circle here, is this is a creative workshop in watercolor, gouache, and ink. It says so on the cover. And she does talk about gouache and ink somewhat, but I feel like the vast majority of her focus is on the watercolor. And while I can understand that, I come from a comics background where inking is actually really important, and I think there's a lot you can say about inking, and I've taught a lot of tutorials about inking. So I think instead of assuming, by omission that this is something that might come more naturally to some people. I do wish she had explained some of her inking techniques better, maybe showed us her inking setup, that sort of thing. So she talks a bit about gouache. I feel like it would have benefited from some comparison photos comparing gouache and watercolor. And I also say that she uses watercolor a lot like gouache in terms of a very thick paste consistency frequently in this book. And that's kind of understandable because she's painting with Reeves, and Reeves does have a lot of extenders and fillers in it, so it does behave a little bit more. In dilution, Reeves falls apart, I have found. It works better, more saturated. So I can kind of understand where she's coming from. I also feel like this book would benefit from a section on how to use gouache and what to look for with gouache, when using gouache, when buying gouache. Especially because, as we just talked about, the subtitle of this book is A Creative Workshop in Watercolor, Gouache, and Ink. On page 23, she prefers to use tube watercolor directly on her ceramic plate palette. And I made the note to myself because we're going to be talking about Stoneground paints, and Stoneground paints are half pan paints. They're beautifully small batch made half pan paints, but they're not available in tubes. So I was kind of wondering how she kind of became part of the Stoneground family, how she started working with them, because she works from tubes. And I know it's not so disparate, but I have experienced being told that I'm a bad fit for certain partnerships because I'm a watercolor comic artist and not just a watercolor illustrator. So I know that sometimes companies can be really very particular in exactly what they're looking for and how they want their products to be positioned. I'm going to continue to reiterate. I'm going to beat a dead horse here, and I apologize for this. This book really needs more photos. It would also benefit from more lists and more paragraph breaks. And I'm going to blame that on her publisher, not on her. That's something a good editor, a good beta reader would have caught and would have pointed out. So on page 24, she's another artist with the paint consistency and food analogies. Her thing is mustard, heavy cream, soy sauce with wasabi, and soy sauce. I am not like, when I teach, sometimes I'll talk about like Kool-Aid versus coffee, you know what I mean? But I'm more looking not at the thickness of the paint, but like the visual representation of the paint. But I don't like love food analogies when it comes to watercolor. That said, it's not like I have a better system myself. Part of the reason I don't love it is because some of these are not as universal as people think. I used to love wasabi, but I have to be very careful because ever since I got Sjogren's and it started messing with my mucous membranes, wasabi is intensely painful and I can't flush it out. So I actually don't really remember what the consistency of soy sauce with wasabi looks like because it's been years since I've had it. So that's one of the ways I mean, like, you do have to be kind of careful with some of these analogies because an analogy is meant to make it more easily understood. I also made the note, in addition to the food analogies, that we would really benefit from swatches to see how this looks on paper. So, because with some colors, the difference is striking when it comes to how saturated it is. Like Quin Gold and Indian Yellow and maybe Phthalo Blue, they really shade a lot. Like the more saturated it is, the color can change quite a bit in terms of how it appears. And that would have been a good example. So on page 26, we start talking about our basic techniques. Again, we really need more photos, larger photos. I do not get why these books end up so wordy. Every one of these techniques deserves at least one photo or graphic or multiple because this was published in 2019, right? A lot of the art influencers we've been talking about, they got started later. They had an Instagram, they have a YouTube channel, that sort of thing. So they do have visuals online. The resources were there more. 2019, well, my blog was one of the resources people would think about when thinking about watercolor resources. And while I definitely did my best, I am a small fish. So what I think I'm trying to say is while there were people, a lot of people writing about this topic, it wasn't as ubiquitous. People who bought this book in a store might not think to go online to look these things up and to look for more information. It kind of depends on what generation you're born in. I'm a millennial. We look everything up. We've got a smartphone in our hand all the time. We're always double checking things. So we might do it, but somebody else might not. On page 31, we start talking about color expression. Again, so it's her color theory. We really need graphics to help readers visualize these color theory concepts. This is a really pretty book, but not necessarily the best resource for learning or for beginners. For example, on page 34, the graphic to explain the triadic color harmony, so really the only content on the page, is smaller than the quote and the flash art. You see, and I'll read the quote for you guys, because why not, right? And this is Michael Crespo from his book Watercolor Class. Of all the elements that define painting, color is by far the most complex, abstract, spiritual, and forceful. The colors that we paint most often, the ones we wear, the colors in our dwellings, the ones we cherish most, those that identify us like fingerprints, are apt to change many times as our experience accumulates. A great quote and fitting, but like the quote takes up a third of the page, and the example of a triadic color scheme is maybe a sixth of the page. So it feels kind of like this book isn't, in terms of the graphic design of this book, isn't as focused as one might like to see. So on page 35, we get color psychology, but no useful examples. This is an art book in full color. Surely they could have found examples from Sarah's backlog. So according to the color psychology that she has here, and I'll go ahead and read it for you, red represents confidence, youth, power, passion, anger, and aggression. Orange represents friendliness, warmth, energy, and adventure, often associated with red's power and yellow's friendliness. Yellow, happiness, friendliness, optimism, warmth, and inspiration. If used too much, anxiety and fear. Green, peace, growth, and health, calming. Blue, trust, security, and stability, calming. Purple, luxury, creativity, and wisdom. Pink, hope, sensitivity, romance, youthful femininity. Black, reliability, sophistication, and experience. And white, simplicity and cleanliness, calming. So according to the color psychology she has here, my art is mostly blue. So trust, security, stability, calming. Green, peace, growth, health, and calming. Pink, hope, sensitivity, romance, and youthful femininity. And yellow, happiness, friendliness, optimism, warmth, and inspiration. I've included some examples to show you guys. What do you guys think? Do you guys think I'm pretty in line with her color psychology, or do you think we've kind of fallen off the mark? So on page 36, we talk about composition. The first page is all text, no visuals, no sketches, no diagrams, no sketchbook or thumbnails. How does Sarah capture inspiration? Not everything can be done in the moment. Does she take photos? Does she use Post-its? Does she have a sketchbook? This would be a great time to talk about it. She does kind of, through the photos she's including, walk us through as we go by, but I do think having examples of planning a composition or different types of composition or the composition grid would be a really helpful tool at this point. On page 38, I had to ask myself, why is the one photo we get on this page of her arranging flowers with weird cropping and not something that illuminates focus, pattern, contrast, or proportion? And those are the topics covered on this page. We also get another Michael Crespo quote. So having graphics, and I'll pull this up where you guys can see it, but having graphics to demonstrate all of these elements would be very helpful for helping the reader really understand what she's talking about and getting into her head. I feel like her editor should have requested more visual examples to illustrate how Sarah thinks about these things. She keeps quoting Michael Crespo's Watercolor Class, so I'll give his book a try. Thank you for the rec. On page 39, this is the Working in Botanicals section. She mentions using the photography of florists, not forests, but you probably could do forests. Or you can give us a breakdown of how you utilize and understand your reference. Also, I want to point out to you guys, when you copy a photo, you should give credit, especially if you're copying it one-to-one, rather than just trying to understand how specific flowers look. I realized through this Easily Influenced series, a lot of these artists don't actually talk about utilizing reference. She does, or crediting the reference that you have. So I do want to point that out in case you're new here, you were interested in my thoughts on the book, and you might not be aware of that fact. So on page 40, we have started our botanical lessons. We're starting with watercolor projects. So lessons 1 through 6 are going to be fundamental techniques. 7 through 11 are going to integrate the fundamentals in new and challenging ways, and it's designed to build on each other. 12 through 16 will be creative ways to combine watercolor with gouache and ink. Page 43 begins our technique boxes, and page 45 begins our washes. Now, for the technique boxes, she never actually recommends transferring it to watercolor paper, although it is shown that she is doing that on page 45. I recommend you do these on watercolor paper, even though, and not doing it in the book itself. The paper of this book is just really not that great. You could staple it into the book if you want to. So many of these books dedicate a huge chunk of time to very basic techniques that all of the other books are covering, and this section is so wordy too. I'm going to give Sarah a bit of a pass on this one. She predates a lot of the books that we've talked about, so maybe this kind of a primer was really necessary at this point in time. She does intersperse little essays into the book, which I really like. That was something that I really liked about Josie Lewis's book. And on page 60, she has her Why Art section, Living the Life Unlived. And I didn't know we'd get personal essays, so this would be a great space to also include, I mean, we have some floral illustration here, but it'd be a great space for her sketches, thumbnails, and doodles to give us even more insight into her. On page 63, we start our color charts, and on page 68, she gives us the recipes for the colors we'll be frequently mixing. And I appreciate that. Some artists can get really cagey about how they mix their colors. And some of us are cagey because we don't actually remember how we mix our colors. So we're like, I don't know. I just mix around until I find it. So her color recipes might be really helpful for you so you don't waste paint trying to replicate her colors and failing, and then you get discouraged and then you get frustrated. Muted tones can be challenging to mix right, so this is appreciated. These early exercises are very basic, so these are great if you're afraid of messing up and wasting materials. She often includes takeaways with each project in case you're not quite getting the lesson, and I really like that. Let me see if I can find an example. I guess it doesn't say takeaways, maybe I'm being too literal. The migraine makes me a little weird. So for example, we have a subtleties of color on page 69. As you try your recipes, notice how the final color changes with only the slightest increase of just one of the colors. This is why I like to think of creating colors like a recipe. As we all know, when preparing a dish, the slightest difference in a measurement or ingredient can alter the entire outcome. There are so many amazing color possibilities with each combination of only a few paints. Also keep in mind, watercolor tends to dry about 10 to 20% lighter than when it is painted, so your colors will change slightly as the water fully evaporates and leaves only color behind. So I appreciate these little additional takeaways. And honestly, these kind of tidbits, as if you watched, I don't even know if this is out, that is out when this is out. I reviewed Watercolor Rescue, and it's all tidbits, and I loved Watercolor Rescue. So I'm a big fan of like the little bullet point tidbits that are a little more memorable for me. On page 93, we have an exercise on brushwork, and I really appreciate that. And I think some of you guys who are learning how to do loose florals might appreciate it as well. On page 95, she's encouraging us to check our hold of the brush, and you guys will see that probably right here. I really appreciate that. I am somebody who like holds my brush all funky because I have a really messed up grip. A lot of photos on this page, and they're all really tiny. It would help if she varied the angles so we could actually see how she's managing the brush, what the brush is doing on the paper, how she's holding the brush, if we could see that better. And from there, with this exercise where we're kind of just doing stop and start, she shows us how to turn them into leaf shapes. On page 98, we have our point pressure flowers, and this is actually something she talked about when I took the class with her. And I really want to go back and try her point pressure leaf exercise on page 100, just to kind of loosen things up. I always seem to choke up a little too much, more than I would really like. On page 107, she has a loose leafy wreath. These are all really challenging to say out loud. The project includes beginner instructions and more advanced ideas, and I really like that. Also, she includes tips before you start. I appreciate that as well, so you can have that at the top of your mind while you're practicing. Might save you some mistakes. I still wish her photos were bigger so I could see better, and I appreciate her troubleshooting tips, like on page 110. It's genuinely helpful, and you can kind of tell that she teaches just the way, like teaches in-person classes, the way she presents the material, the way she thinks about the material, the way she's able to troubleshoot issues. It all shows that she has teaching experience and experience working with people, and that is a breath of fresh air, because a lot of these books, you can tell they're only ever used to talking to a camera like I'm doing right now. So on page 124, for the floral bouquet, we are doing layering and complementary colors. She mentions on 125, too much fussing and touching of your flower petals can actually interrupt the fluidness of your watercolor. That's the story of my life. Seeing her brush in the shot, and you have to go a little further to actually see that, seeing her brush in the shot gives context to the size of her painting. These florals are larger than I'd assumed, and that makes a big difference in how much water and paint, or how much makes a big difference in how the water and paint handle on the paper. Size context clues in the hero images would be helpful, but she does provide templates, so that is kind of your context clue, I guess. But I would like to see them in the hero image. On page 143, we have our plant lady, watercolor and ink. I'm always drawn to people who draw people. On page 151, she mentions including a reference section. My girl, finally, somebody who's willing to shout out other artists and how they learned what they learned. I'm always looking for more information, so I appreciate that. On page 170, we learn about painting florals, the thrill, the fill, and the spill. I wish she'd given examples of these things, the thrill, the spill, and the fill, because she just has a large hero image. It's an aesthetic photo of a bouquet. It's not even a painting, it's just a photo of it. So I do wish she'd use this space to show examples of the thrill, the fill, and the spill. Maybe that's just me. On page 172, I do have, okay, she calls them small pine needles, or small pine leaves, I'm sorry. And as someone who is interested in botany and co-owns a pine tree farm in Franklinton, Louisiana, I was like, I thought pine leaves were pine needles. These are leaves, these are just leaves though, they're not even needles. Maybe she should have just called them generic leaf shapes or something like that. Because again, if you tend to think literally when you're reading something like this, it might trip you up. And that's something her editor probably should have caught. So a lot of what makes her art good is Sarah's ability to both draw and ink, which is very underplayed in this book. Her watercolor is okay, but the techniques are pretty basic. A drawing primer would have been so helpful. I honestly cannot tell you what her drawing process looks like from this book. I have no idea. She doesn't talk about it. She doesn't show underdrawings. She doesn't show her using reference. I don't know where she gets her figures from. She does not talk about that at all. We are here to paint, apparently. On page 180, we finally talk a little bit about gouache regarding wildflowers layering with gouache. This is the first new use of techniques that we've seen in a while. It's annoying that the hero images are only at the end of each lesson, so you have to flip around to get an idea of what the final project looks like. I had no idea wildflowers were tiny until I flipped to the end. And to be fair, and I'm going to show you guys this, for each project header, she has like big text on like a black or dark blue background. So like you could be using that space with the hero image to sell us on the idea. So it just feels kind of like a missed opportunity. On page 194, we start talking about resources, and there weren't as many outside resources as I'd hoped, just 3. So if you are interested in to continue building your skill set, in the following areas, check out the recommended books: Drawing Flowers by Allie Coach. That's what we were just talking about. How to Draw Modern Florals and Florals by Hand. Those are also published by this company. Fundamental Water Skills by Michael Crespo. Watercolor Class and Color Theory by Joseph Albers. Interaction of Color and Stephen Quiller, Color Choices. So those are the three sections. So Drawing Florals would be How to Draw Modern Flowers and Florals by Hand. For watercolor skills, it would be Watercolor Class. And then for Color Theory, it would be Interaction of Color and Color Choices. The books she has read for inspiration are The War of Art and Madeleine L'Engle's And It Was Good, A Stone for a Pillow, and Sold into Egypt. Some of her favorite supplies, we've kind of talked about that earlier. And that's basically it for recommended, which is a little sad, I won't lie. I would have loved to have seen a really robust resources section, but you know, what a bump. So on page 197, our templates begin. These are on perforated pages to make tracing or scanning easier. So what are my final thoughts on modern watercolor botanicals? Also though, the spiral binding catches on itself and then I can't shut it. I have struggled with this book a few times now and the wire has actually kind of come loose. I have had this book for a little while, but this is, I was hoping to do like a cute little like shut it and reveal the cover, but that's not happening. So there you go. Oh man, I thought I was gonna be so slick. I was not so slick. So that was Modern Watercolor Botanicals, a creative workshop in watercolor, gouache, and ink from the mint gardener, Sarah Simon. So my final thoughts. My gripes are the same for most art how-to books. Too wordy, the photos are too small, not enough studio/sketchbook/development process. But I think a lot of y'all will enjoy this book and find it helpful. I recommend it for non-drawers who want to make beautiful art now and drawers who are newer to watercolor who are looking for some simple techniques to bring into their work. I do feel like one of my big complaints is there's way too little focus on ink and gouache, considering it is on the cover. That's part of the selling point. That said though, I did enjoy this book. It is a beautiful book. Like Christy Rice's Joy of Watercolor, like Christy Rice's book, Joy of Watercolor, Free Spirited Watercolor, Watercolor Joy. I have a migraine. My brain is not recalling very well today. I think it would make a wonderful Trojan horse watercolor coffee table book. The book you leave on your coffee table so when friends come over, they see it and they feel inspired and you can like rope them into getting started with watercolor with you, right? Or the book you give to get a friend interested into watercolor, that sort of thing. If you're already pretty familiar with watercolor and you're not necessarily a fan of Sarah Simon, although her art is beautiful, I don't think this book would be particularly helpful for you. It is not one that you just absolutely have to run out and buy. However, if you are a fan of her art, this could be a good way to own a little bit of her art and to have it in your home. So now let's go check her out on social media and see how she do what she do. I still can't shut it. The spiral binding is still broken. So we checked out her book. Let's check her out online. We're going to start with her website, themintgardener.com, and then we'll move over to socials. And to begin with, her site has like a very fresh gardening feel, although I wouldn't, from like this part at the beginning. Well, there we go. There's the watercolor. All right. She hooked us in. So it's pretty simple and straightforward as a site. I am noticing, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. A lot of the websites we've been looking at have this kind of scroll thing, and I know this is common web design, I'm just pointing it out, where you have like different sections kind of going to different places. This one actually doesn't scroll forever like some of the ones we've looked at, and it also isn't as, it doesn't feel like a funnel. Obviously she has things to sell and there's nothing wrong with that, but some of the artists we've looked at in the Easily Influenced series, it's all funnel with them. So we'll start with the courses, since I did take one of her classes during NAMTA. And she, sorry, I saw the retreat, and these kind of art retreats have become kind of a or last year, 2024, 2023, they were kind of a popular thing for artists to do, or to offer as a retreat. To me, that's a lot of money to put in without necessarily, I mean, that's the cost of a class at SCAD when I was going to SCAD. So, you know, it's a lot of money to put in. This is much, much easier. And this actually seems pretty cool. And there's only 2 here. So I guess it's like the one that's coming up. And then, in fact, I'm going to check her out next, grab it while I'm thinking about it. So just 2 courses, not like 20 classes like some of the ones we've seen. Next, we'll check out the books. That link doesn't seem to work, or my internet doesn't seem to work. I don't know. We'll try the shop next instead. Oh, here we go. Ooh, that's just watercolor paper though. I wouldn't call that a book per se. And journals. And here's the one that we were looking at. Although the watercolor workbook seems pretty charming. It looks like it's got a lot of the kind of watercolor that made her famous to begin with. Oh. And then she has a coloring book as well. So let's see. Let's count the books. I'm just curious. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Not going to count that because it's just paper, and 6. Let's see what she's got in her shop. I'm always looking for good ideas. In fact, while I'm recording this, I've started asking people, see, I had an idea for my gift guide for this year, and then this year became this year, and I decided to kind of refocus, because originally my gift guide was going to be very Blick focused, like, you know, stuff that is pretty accessible, most people can get. And then I was like, I actually really want to focus on people who are actually making things and making art supplies. So I've been asking folks for their recommendations for handmade art supplies. So her shop links to Etsy. She's taking a short break. A lot of these have been, a lot of the people in the Easily Influenced series have been on a short break. I just wonder why. It did look like she had some supply kits, which would have been super cute. Like this would have been a really cute kit. Wish that I could have taken a look at it with you guys. And then let's learn a little bit more about Sarah. Hi, I'm the Mint Gardener. Sarah Simon is the artist and author at The Mint Gardener. Find inspiration in the ever-blooming variety of textures and colors in her Seattle-based urban farm. Sarah creates and teaches lush watercolors with a capital W, inspired by the diverse variety of herbs, flowers, and trees grown in her garden. With a continually blooming following of botanical and art lovers alike, her teaching has received worldwide attention with her online painting courses in the International Watercolor Summit, Workshop Week, and her monthly live Zoom teaching sessions. Sarah has taught thousands of people how to watercolor
and with her teaching talents has made it such an approachable and enjoyable art form, both for the experienced and novice alike. Sarah's work has been featured in many publications and blogs worldwide and has been celebrated in the form of commercial product design, stationery, and textiles, as well as wholesale and private commissions. Just a few of her clients include Nordstrom, Country Living, Facebook, the University of Washington, Expedia, Sakura of America, Blick Artist Materials, Winsor & Newton, Target, Estee Lauder, and Sur La Table. Her books, Modern Watercolor Botanicals and the Plant Lady Coloring Book, were released in November 2019 and are international bestsellers. Her third book, Watercolor Workbook, was just released this April and is already a #1 bestseller. Day to day, you can find Sarah painting and sharing creativity on her Instagram, as well as hosting the #Flower Painting Club for an online community of painting lovers. She lives with her family in Seattle on her urban farm, where she loves to garden and spend time with her family, along with their 7 pet chickens and Spike, the bearded dragon. Coincidentally, her favorite flowers happen to be bearded irises. Well, for now anyways, it's hard to pick a favorite flower. She enjoys seeking quiet moments for sketching and painting, making small bouquets of flowers and herbs, or reading. She loves Jesus, exploring new places, and enjoys anything that includes the sea, friends, and food. Speaking of food, if she could eat an egg salad sandwich and sip on a big cup of creamy coffee every day, she would consider herself very satisfied indeed. And yes, as a Pacific Northwest native, she does enjoy the gloomy gray days a bit more than the hot sunny ones. She kind of looks like a young Martha Stewart, if you like some of those. And then we could take a look at the tools that she loves. These are all links, but I wonder if they go to Amazon or if they go anywhere. I can't tell if her website is goofing on me, or if my internet is really slow, or maybe it's a combination of the two. On Blick. Okay, all right, so that makes for easy shopping. If you're interested in what materials she's using, this is what is listed in the tools section. It's an attractive, fairly straightforward website, not, overly much like some of the ones I've seen. You don't feel like you're getting lost in a negative way on the site, and I appreciate that. I mean, you can get lost in a good way. Like, I used to love to explore webcomic websites, right? And like look at the gallery and look at their forums. Like, that's lost in a good way. But sometimes you feel like you're getting lost because you could just keep scrolling and scrolling, and it keeps funneling and trying to sell you something. And that's not really the vibe here. So her Instagram has, it's kind of a mix of pictures of her teaching, pictures of her classes, maybe those are her friends, I can't tell, as well as her art. There's some charming line and wash, there's some botanical studies. It seems like a nice mix. And it definitely seems like she gets a good amount of engagement, amount of likes on her Instagram. And as we've talked about in this series before, I know for her, it was really more about her blog and Instagram than just one. But for a lot of these artists, it's basically they are famous on Instagram first. And actually, some of them, I think, also had a popular Etsy, but none of them really talk about that. Like, it seemed like several of them did like kits of some sort on Etsy for a while and built up a following there. But you only kind of find that out if you snoop a little bit, which, I do wish if having a combo of a blog and an Etsy where you're selling your kits was how you built up that following, people would talk about that more. I'm not necessarily saying that's what's going on with her. It's just something that I've noticed. And it does make it a little bit challenging if you wanted to follow in somebody's footsteps and build up a following in the same way. And like, let's be real, a lot of these artists are teaching other people how to be artists, or they're teaching other people how to have art businesses. So I would think that's an important thing to talk about if you're self-aware enough that you've realized that's how you built up your following. And I'm not when I say that, I don't mean that to sound judgmental. I could not tell you how I have found some of the people, like how people find me. I'm just not that level of self-aware, I guess. And then we just checked out her Instagram. So Mint Gardener it's going to bring up a lot of results that are not really relevant to her. And again, I'm not really trying to dig. I just wanted to see if there was some. Oh, another thing I've noticed too about these influential artists is that they tend to write blog posts about one another, be on each other's podcasts. They tend to cross collaborate, and that really helps a lot as well. She has like a little featurette on Princeton, and we're going to be talking about Stoneground paint in a bit. See, I'm still trying to decide how I want to handle the Stoneground part, because I have used their paints, as you guys have seen. I also have another one of their influencer palettes. This is from a Canadian artist, so I may break that off into its own thing. But also, I know that these are really nice paints because I've handled them, and I kind of want to do a field test with them. But I know that these easily influenced videos get long, so I'm wondering if I should maybe like just swatch them for you guys here, and then we can pull them out into their own video and have a chance to talk about them a little bit more. And that way, you know, I'm not fatiguing you guys, because we've already talked about the book and we're talking about Sarah and her online presence. And, you know, I do think talking about her collaboration with Stoneground is important, but I don't want to wear you guys out completely. So another thing I've noticed, though, is that a lot of these artists won't, unless they are self-taught, unless they learn via the internet and via books, they don't want to necessarily volunteer where they've learned art. And I like Sarah. I think she's very charming. But I do wish, even if you are, you know, you learned on your own, you learned from the internet, you learned from books, as most artists do. Even those of us who attended school, we learn from each other, we learn from books, we learn from the internet too. I do wish people would talk about their resources more to make that more accessible, and just to normalize that. And to kind of make it so that people who are entirely school of internet, entirely learned on their own, don't have to feel defensive about that, because it's very normal to learn like that. And all of us are continuing our educations by, you know, going to the library and checking out books, or admiring other artists and reading their books and that kind of thing. That's a very normal part of the process. So I think we've basically covered what we need to cover. I don't really want to like dig into her personal life. That's not the point of this. It seems like she keeps it pretty simple. She teaches a lot of classes and workshops. She does collaborations with stores and with companies like Princeton and Blick. And she has her website as well as her Instagram to help bring in new people. All right, so now it is time to take a look at the Mint Gardener's collaboration with Stoneground paints. And I've kind of already done a whole lot of preface on this. I talked about taking the class while at NAMTA. I talked about meeting the owners of Stoneground while also at NAMTA. They are a very small Canadian company that is trying to reproduce the old English way of manufacturing watercolors, which I think is really neat. They are a family-owned company, so it's basically like the grandfather, who is an artist, his son's wife, and then their children, plus a few employees. So it's a really small operation. I have had this package since February, and it is not February. It is November currently. So it's been sitting and waiting for me while I've just been distracted and working on other stuff. So the back of the package actually had a handwritten label that I was trying to be careful not to show you guys, but I appreciate like the care that goes into it, because like, let's be honest, when we're buying things from Amazon or AliExpress, so many of these things, it's just like no care at all, no customer service at all. So it's really nice when a company does put that little bit of extra in there. I also have the Brittany Tough palette. Give me a sec. This is the palette that I picked up at NAMTA, since they were, well, just watch the NAMTA blog. I'm pretty sure I explained, like, Stoneground was there. They had a beautiful setup, and they were selling some of their paints on the last day, and I was able to buy some for about half price, and that was just too good a deal to pass up. This palette has kind of more of your basic color palette. And then the Mint Gardener palette has kind of more floral colors. Inside is a card that says Stoneground Paint Company, and you can visit them at stonegroundpaint.com, made in Canada, artist quality. And there's a nice little handwritten note as well, which I really appreciate. Then inside is a little bit of paperwork about their collaboration. You can pause it if you want to read it, but it's basically the same stuff we've talked about when talking about her and when checking out her websites and when talking about the book. And then this is actually a slightly different one. Our paint is inspired by nature and ground by hand. We craft our paint in small batches the traditional way. Stoneground paint is handmade on the Canadian prairies. We put exceptional care and craftsmanship into each batch of our hand-ground paint. Our colors are permanent and light-fast and with a smooth, fluid consistency. Top-grade gum arabic, locally sourced honey, and the world's best pigments combine to create traditionally made paint, ground by hand in small batches. Our traditional approach, let me make sure we're focused there, results in a watercolor paint with amazing translucency, luminosity, and depth, while enhancing the effects of glazing techniques. A combination of high pigment load, single pigment formulation, and no fillers or extenders result in bright, clear, vibrant color. And then let's take a look. Ooh, it's actually rather heavy. And it's just a pretty simple little tin with a vinyl sticker on the front. Inside is a swatch sheet, a little piece of foam board, just as a buffer to protect the paints in transit. Very simple and very just easy. You know what I mean? Like not a lot of fuss, and I appreciate that. These were stickied in, they're not magneted in, so they have shifted just a little bit. But even though these have sat, there isn't really any cracking. They are not overly tacky to the touch, and this is Southeast Louisiana. They shouldn't be dusty, but I'm just gonna kind of remove any surface dust anyway. And you guys might notice that these have been overfilled. You see, this is, and that's not a bad thing. They have been filled like muffin tops, right? Right? Everybody likes the top part of a muffin. Actually, I like the bottom part, but you know what I'm saying, right? It's like a muffin top where the paint has been filled so many times that it bowls over. So basically the process for this is generally you fill it to the top, you let it dry, and it's gonna sink under. You fill it again, same process, and you just repeat until it's nice and really, really full. So here are some hand-done swatches here. This is the Splendid 12. It includes Naphtha Red, Dahlia Pink, Bloom Hue, Florence Blush, Hansa Yellow Light, Naples Yellow Deep, Gamboge, Olive Green, Pansy Blue, Delft Blue Hue, Lamp Black, and Titanium White. And I have had a little bit of experience painting with these, and I really love them. They are a real delight to paint with. That's why I have two, not the same colors in general. I think the only duplicate is the Hansa Yellow Light. What I want to do for you guys today is I am going to swatch the Mint Gardener palette. In another video, we will take a look at Brittany Tuff and her palette. And then in a third video, I will use these paints to paint a field test and talk about the qualities that these paints have. I think that is the fairest way to give you guys the information you might be looking for without this video being a 4-hour long video. Now, since I have painted with these paints before, because in the NAMTA workshop, they loaded us down. They gave us half pans. They gave us dot cards. I mean, they gave us a lot of samples. We had the chance to play around with this palette, actually, very similar to this palette. I think there's a manganese purple in there, which I loved so much that manganese violet, that I bought a half pan from them, from their store at NAMTA. But anyway, so I already know I really like these watercolors. I already know they are a joy to paint with. I'm really looking forward to the field test with these. I think it's going to be an absolute delight. Because I have this experience, but I do want to swatch these for you guys and kind of talk about the properties, especially because This is a very particular color palette selection based on the taste of another artist. I definitely, if you look at the book, if you look at her art, you can see where this color palette is coming from. It makes sense for her. It feels like a very curated color selection, and I get it. But as artists, we work very differently, and we have we do actually both paint people and plants a lot. So there is some subject matter in, overlap. But I think we handle colors a little bit differently, how we mix things, what convenience colors we like, that sort of thing. So it'll be really interesting to kind of just play around with these and share this with you guys. First time I used Stoneground watercolors, it was on Hahnemule watercolor paper. So I thought it would be really fun to do some swatches on a really assertive paper. So this is Shizen watercolor paper. This is their rough texture, and I'm hoping that it'll really bring out the personality of these paints. I am going to go ahead and give these a very light spritz. I don't want to saturate them too much. I have another case of missing show notes I definitely took, and now I cannot find them. So I am doing washout swatches where we have mass tone at the top and then we blend it out with some water, and hopefully this will give us a good idea of what the colors look like both in mass tone as well as whatever granulation they may have to offer. There are a lot of really light colors in this set, which can make it a little bit difficult to record, and frankly I was hoping for more florals. We have two colors that are already really similar, the two icarus at the top, and then our yellow, our orangey color, and our green gold are all very similar. So to paint watercolor florals, I was hoping for more variation in this set. That said, the colors are rich and buttery, almost gouache-like. A little goes a long way, and it will be a lot of fun to try these out along with the Brittany Tufts set and see how these handle for the kind of watercolor illustration that I do, because I tend to draw teeny tiny little faces with lots of fiddly little details, and these kind of watercolors can be hit or miss for something like that. So I kind of look forward to seeing how they're going to handle on Arch's watercolor paper in my art style rather than with just swatches. So make sure that you are subscribed so that you don't miss out on that. I also wanted to do some opacity swatches since these handle so much like a gouache. So this is just a little bit of alcohol marker, and I'm just swatching the watercolors on top of it. And you can see that some of these colors are fairly opaque. Now, given the price of this palette, I do wish that the half pants had magnets on the back to make it a little bit easier to reposition them. I do appreciate the inclusion of the swatch card, and there's something just so satisfying about painting in these little swatches so that you guys can get a really good idea of what these colors look like. Is this a color palette that you guys enjoy and that you would use, or is this a little too specific to be useful for you? Let me know down in the comments. Here's Stoneground's website. I think it has a really charming layout. It is bright and colorful. They hand make their paint, so we can explore their process, their watercolor, and their gouache. We could visit their shop. We could check out their artist collaborations right now. The Mint Gardener is the one that's featured. At NAMTA, they were working to find more retailers to carry their product. And if you're in Southeast Louisiana, Lefebvre in Houma, Louisiana carries Stoneground paint. And then they have additional resources as well as the ability to contact them. So we're going to take a look at their process because these are kind of expensive paints, and it's important to kind of understand why they're expensive paints. So these are using, and everyone claims that they're using the finest pigments, so I'm not really going to be able to comment on that. I don't have that particular experience base. They're also using honey as well as gum arabic, and they don't have additional fillers or extenders. And if you've watched my student grade showdown, you can kind of see why additional fillers and extenders can start to become a problem, especially when it's used in excess. And you can also see why when we were looking at so many paints that were dyes mordanted onto another substrate, usually like a shell type substrate, why working with pigments might be a preference. So they talk about how artists used to make a lot of their supplies themselves, that they feel very passionately about this. Most of these are single pigment. I'm not so sure that the Mint Gardener set is single pigment. We have a lot of like opaque hues, like Bloom Hue or Florence Blush. So I'm not, and then also we have a couple of colors that kind of granulate into two separate colors. Like Pansy Blue has an olive undertone to it that granulates out, and Delft Blue Hue also has like a two pigment thing going on, and I think their Lamp Black also has like a bit of a blue undercast to it. So I think in general they are working with single pigments, but I think for some of these collaborations there may be two pigment or three pigment mixes, and that's not necessarily a problem. Again, if you hang out here, you know I love super granulators, and a lot of the ways you get that super granulation split is by having a staining pigment mixed with a granulating pigment. I thought they had a video of them making their paints. I guess that's changed over time. And some beautiful colors here. So these are in their modern series. They do say that these are non-toxic, so I'm assuming they're foregoing things like cadmium or cobalt, although we have a cobalt aquamarine. So my question would be, like, if they're actually using the true pigment, cobalt's pretty toxic, so that's not a non-toxic paint. And then here are the colors in their traditional lineup. I don't actually know if chromium oxide is toxic or not, actually, so I'm not going to comment on that. And then they have some beautiful colors in their mineral series. So they have a small but growing range of watercolors. I know they work with artists to develop new colors. And then here is their gouache. I know a lot of you guys are getting really into gouache. I still love the translucency of watercolor, so that's still where my heart is. And then here's the watercolor in their shop. So their paints are a bit expensive for half pans, with a half pan starting at $13.95. But I feel like as we're seeing more brands like Michael Harding entering the market, and those are really expensive, that this is actually fairly reasonable. I really love that with the set dressing on all of these shots is really beautiful. It's inspiring. It's attention to detail. You can see like where they got the inspiration for some of these colors, or some of the colors that these are referencing in nature. You can also see a big paint out of each color to give you an idea of how they granulate. It's not like a web swatch the way Blick does web swatches. These are all swatches of the colors. And of course, some of these colors are so brilliant that a computer screen, like taking a photo of them and then showing them on a computer screen, can't really capture how beautiful those colors are. But I still appreciate, like with this dioxazine purple, like it starts to go like ultraviolet purple here in this picture, which is not a complaint about the paints. It is a statement of how purple this is, how intense the color is. But the photography just makes you want to like grab the wallet and start picking up some paints. It's really beautiful and inspiring. Oh, that's a gorgeous color. I think they've added that to the lineup. Vienna Violet is beautiful. And then they have some gorgeous metallics too. Because I paint comics and I paint for reproduction, I am less interested in metallics because they just don't work the same way. Their gouaches, from what I can see here, are very saturated, high opacity for the most part. Looks like they've got good coverage. I know some of you guys like to use your gouache as watercolor. I do that also sometimes. So I know when we were talking about M. Graham's, some people like to buy their gouache and use it as watercolor because it's more economical. The pigment load is higher, so it can last longer. That might be something to consider for this. And then here are the palettes. They come in sets of 6. I think they come in larger sets as well. Yeah, sets of 14. And then our artist collaboration that we were talking about here. See, the olive green she got is the olive green I swatched is not the olive green she got, but I think she works well. I did a watercolor swatch out with water, so it blended out, but I didn't get the intensity that she got. I'm a little envious because I love this color. It's one of my favorite colors. Of course, that might have been from the gouache collection. So you guys can see these do get pretty expensive. I bought these out of pocket using funds from Patreon. I paid full price. I believe I might have caught a sale. I have to go back and look at my screen recordings to see. Usually with these kind of really expensive things, it will live in my email until I get like a discount code that makes it a little bit more affordable for me, because reviewing stuff for you guys is really expensive. But this was purchased out of pocket using funds from Patreon. Ooh, what a tongue twister there. You can pick up some of the colors open stock. I'm not sure if that was available at the time I ordered this. I went with the splendid 12 color palette, and you guys can see that it's a good chunk of change here. It is $168.55 in Canadian dollars. And I'll put on the screen how that converts to USD. Pretty sure though I had to wait for a sale on that one. And then in the United States, see, Lefebvre's. Anyway, that is Stoneground Watercolors. That's their website. So if you guys are interested in trying these yourself, if you enjoy small batch watercolors and you want to try something that has a really creamy consistency, you can find them at stonegroundpaint.com. So I am kind of conflicted because Sarah Simon seems like a lovely person and I did really enjoy her class, but I had some kind of mixed opinions about her book. I think it is a beautiful book and I think it could make a lovely inspirational book, coffee table book. Definitely something for someone who's already somewhat familiar with watercolor. Maybe if you gave this in combination with like Hello Watercolor, that could be a really good sort of watercolory gift. So another thing that the metal edges, I know it seems like kind of a nitpick, but normally I love these spiral bound books and the metal edges just kind of wanted to cut me and cut everything. They're beautiful, but they ended up being more of a deterrent than they did a selling point. As for the Stoneground watercolors, I'm just gonna so I use them in the class and I really like them in the class. I am not necessarily a big fan of this particular set of colors for the kind of watercolor that I do. Sarah and I do very different kinds of florals. I tend to like really saturated colors. I generally will avoid these kind of more muted beigey colors. That's just not my thing. So I really want to encourage you guys to stick around because I am going to be checking out the Stoneground Brittany Tuff palette soon. And then I'm going to do a field test with both sets of watercolors combined in my own art style. And that's when I'm really going to be able to give you guys feedback and to really be able to speak on the quality of these paints in depth. So hold on tight, make sure you click the subscribe button, hit the bell notification so you don't miss that update. I really enjoyed being easily influenced by Sarah Simon and sharing it with you guys. Let me know what you think of this book or any of her other books, because she does have quite a few books out on the market, down in the comments below. And I look forward to seeing you guys again really soon with another art supply review, tutorial, or easily influenced. Bye guys!